Many people don't know that Darwin did not attempt to answer the question of the origin of life. He had a brief speculation that he offered about it in a letter to a friend, Joseph Hooker, about life emerging from some simpler chemicals in what he called a warm little pond.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Good Fight Radio Show. And on today's episode, we have a special guest. And a lot of that comes from my own testimony, because back in 2008, my now brother in Christ, Adam Rundgren, took me to see a documentary titled Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And now at the time, I was in college. I was more of a newfound atheist. And I had believed that a lot of those in the scientific community had the answers to the origin of the universe that might have bothered me, but they would have those answers. So I had appealed to that authority whenever I had questions regarding those origins. But what Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed did was expose not only the blackballing that was going on towards the professors who posited intelligent design, but they even were blackballing and maligning those professors who even published other people's works regarding intelligent design. Specifically, the one who I noticed was poking at the scientific community's hornet's nest was none other than Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. And now, Dr. Meyer is a wonderful author who's written books such as The Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and his latest book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. And these books are mightily important for us to understand some of the wonderful evidences that God has let us have, really in his providence and in his love, to show us his handiwork, to show us who he is. So I am beyond excited to welcome to the show Dr. Stephen C. Meyer. Welcome to the Good Fight Radio Show.
Thanks for having me on, Chad.
Well, as I said, and I hadn't even told you this in intro, I am excited to have you because personally, your work had an amazing effect on me, because I do believe watching that film in 2008 was just before I came to Christ in 2009. And it really did remove a lot of obstacles, because I had trusted that when I came to the scientific community, maybe I didn't understand, but, if I appealed to that authority, they would know how to answer the reason for, the origin of the universe, how it all started, abiogenesis, something. And when I watched that film, I realized that their answers were no good. And you were a big reason for that.
Well, a lot of people have that same assumption that the scientific community has the questions of biological origins in particular all sewn up. But when you get into the evidence, it turns out that it's no such situation prevails. In particular, with the vexing question of the origin of the first life. Many people don't know that Darwin did not attempt to answer the question of the origin of life. He had a brief speculation that he offered about it in a letter to a friend, Joseph Hooker, about life emerging from some simpler chemicals in what he called a warm little pond. But in 160 some odd years since Darwin's publication of The Origin of the Species, scientists are no closer to understanding how life would have evolved via an undirected chemical evolutionary process, where chemical evolution refers to the process of life coming from non-life, from simpler non-living chemicals. And that was one of the things that was discussed in the film Expelled. And there was, of course, a telling interview at the end where Ben Stein, the host of the documentary, got Richard Dawkins to acknowledge that neither he nor anyone else knew how life had arisen by an undirected chemical evolutionary process. And instead, Dawkins actually speculated that there may well be a signature of intelligence inside life, and then he posited that perhaps life had been seeded here from another planet by an intelligent designer of an extraterrestrial kind. So it was a surprising twist at the end of the film, where even the world's most prominent scientific atheist acknowledged that there may be evidence of intelligent design, but not a design he was willing to consider might have come from an ultimate creator.
Yeah, and I have to be honest, it's funny you bring that one up because specifically that and people talking about stuff on the backs of crystals in that film and whatnot. I think it was that one, that specific no non-weird answer that for me was kind of a kick in the gut because I was like, man, I thought at least they would have some answers to this. And, having aliens drop off some goo or something, I just thought this was just not what I was expecting. And I thought that was really interesting. And if you guys haven't checked out the film, we'll put a link in the description. I would love for you guys to check it out because people were publishing your work and then they were getting maligned. There were some tenure problems. Could you just go into that a little bit before we talk about your new book?
Yeah, sure. The beginning of the film was telling the story of 5 scientists who had been effectively expelled from the academy because they had come to perceive that there was evidence of design, of intelligent design in life and the universe. And one of the stories that Ben Stein told intersected with some of my work in the following way. I published an article, a peer-reviewed article, advancing the theory of intelligent design in 2004 at a journal called The Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, which was the technical journal of the Smithsonian Institution. And while nothing happened to me, the editor who allowed the paper to go through peer review and then subsequently published it upon receiving favorable peer review reports was persecuted in a fairly aggressive way. His name is Richard Sternberg. He has 2 earned PhDs in biology, one in mathematical biology. He's quite a genius. He had, at that point, 40 peer-reviewed papers. I don't know how many he has now. But after the paper was published, the museum started receiving angry letters from subscribers to the journal, and an emergency meeting was convened by the organization that oversaw the publication of the journal. And the president of that organization told Dr. Sternberg that he should not come to the meeting, even though he was the editor of the journal, because tempers were running so high he couldn't guarantee his personal safety. Eventually, he was transferred out from under the of a friendly colleague. He was denied access to his office, his scientific samples, his keys were taken away, and he was placed in an office next to an administrator where they could, quote, keep an eye on him. And on a parallel track, the people began to, from the museum, apparently, we're not exactly sure, but people started to make inquiries with the National Institutes of Health, where he held a dual appointment. And we're trying to get him fired. And it took the intervention of a U.S. senator to protect his job there, even though that wasn't even the entity that had published the journal. So it was really a horrific experience. And finally, the hostility there was such that he ended up leaving the Smithsonian Institution altogether.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was in college, that first semester after becoming a believer, I had taken an English course, and the required reading, the first 2 readings were Darwin and then Stephen Jay Gould. And so those were the first 2 readings, and we were then required to give a final paper, and on the final paper, we had to get it approved by him because he didn't want to debate abortion and so forth. And so I actually said, I want to debate on intelligent design, and then he's like, I don't know. I said, hey, here's the video, and I gave him Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. And he said, you know what? And I think it kind of played because he's a college professor and he didn't like the fact that people were getting blackballed, even though he disagreed with them. And he let me write the paper. And then the next semester, he actually told a friend of mine, he's like, yeah, I think there is an intelligent designer behind all this. So there was some good
Oh,
evidence.
interesting.
In my first
You actually
semester.
Persuaded your professor. Yeah.
Yeah. With my first paper in
good,
college.
good for him for at least being open to the debate. That's a big part of academic freedom. And the story of the Expelled began with the story of the abridgment of the academic freedom of some very prominent scientists. And in the case of Sternberg, he wasn't even the author of the paper. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about the case, and the writer there said, Sternberg wasn't even the heretic. It was that guy Meyer out there in Seattle at the Discovery Institute. It was so. Anyway, yeah, there have been many such cases like that. But I think when you see that type of behavior among scientists, it's actually a tell, and it's a tell of weakness, of intellectual insecurity. You don't need to resort to those tactics if you're confident of your case. And as we've made the case, first against chemical evolutionary theory and indeed biological evolutionary theory, that is neo-Darwinism, and then subsequently the positive case for intelligent design, more and more scientists have been persuaded by the arguments that we've made. But there has been a kind of rearguard action among people in the scientific establishment. I wouldn't say the scientific establishment. It's the evolutionary establishment. It's the Darwinian establishment. And they've tried to shut down the debate and made it very difficult for people who are raising questions about what is now a 160-year-old theory from coming to the surface. But I think the situation has changed a lot since 2004 when I published that paper, and just the network of scientists who are interested in intelligent design, the evidence for intelligent design, and the way in which the concept of design can be used as what's called a heuristic in science, a guide to further research. And we have scientists now all over the world, some of whose research we're supporting Institute, others who are doing this independently, who are finding more and more evidence of design in biology in particular, but also using the concept of intelligent design to make predictions about what one ought to find when someone looks at life. And one of the first key predictions, in fact, one that was made by Richard Sternberg very early on, was the idea that the junk DNA, the so-called the DNA that performs no function as far as building proteins, isn't junk, that it does perform important functions. And that has now been verified by some very important research that was published in 2011 out of something called the ENCODE project. So those of us who were sympathetic to design or open to the possibility of it thought, well, maybe these big sections of the genome that aren't coding for proteins are still doing something important, which is what we'd expect if life had been intelligently designed. Lo and behold, those non-coding regions of the genome are functioning much like an operating system in a computer that is coordinating the timing and the expression of the data files that do code for proteins. So it's what's been discovered is that the genome is part of a hierarchical information processing system that is just mind-blowing in its complexity. And it's reminiscent of things that we have in our own high-tech digital world that our own software and hardware engineers design, but it's much more sophisticated than that. So we're seeing design at every level of life, and that's a great way to look at life and a great way to study it from the assumption of evidence of that design. So it's kind of a twofold thing. A good scientific research program will have an argument for a perspective, but then once that perspective is reasonably well established in the minds of at least some scientists, then those scientists use that to guide further research. And we're into that stage of the research program now, and I think that's very exciting.
No, that is really exciting to hear, and I love for people to hear that. And, you were also the author of two other books, Signature in the Cell and then Darwin's Doubt as well. And would you say when it comes to the return of the God hypothesis that this one right here kind of, I don't know, I think it plays really well with those other two as well?
Well, it was intended to build off of the argument that I made in the first two books. And you mentioned maybe I brought it up, the alien designer hypothesis of Richard Dawkins. I think he now would disavow that. I think he felt that he was sorry he got into that, I think would be fair to say. But there have been scientists going back to Francis Crick and Fred Hoyle, very prominent scientists who have proposed the idea that yes, there is evidence of design in life, but it must have come from some sort of intelligence within the cosmos, a kind of immanent intelligence, an alien being of some kind. And so in the first book, I argued for intelligent design without attempting to settle the question or argue for one perspective or another about who the designing agent might be. Is an immanent intelligence within the cosmos? That's a logical possibility, not one that I'm favorable to, but it's a logical possibility. Another possibility is that the designer responsible for life and the universe is a transcendent intelligence, in other words, God. And so in the new book, I decided to address this question of the identity of the designing intelligence. I'd had lots of readers ask me, well, who do you think the designer is, and what can science tell us about that question? So that's kind of where I picked up the discussion in the new book, Return to the God Hypothesis, where I made a case for not just a designing intelligence of some kind, but rather a designing intelligence who has the attributes that Jews and Christians and other traditional theists have long ascribed or associated with the concept of God: transcendence, intelligence, and therefore we're talking about a personal entity, not an impersonal force, and also an entity that is capable and willing to act within the universe long after the beginning of the universe. So not a deistic creator either.
You know, in the book, you talk about this X factor in terms of the scientific explosion in Europe. And you talk about some differences, and maybe you explain to the audience maybe some of the differences when it comes to the God of the Hebrew Bible versus maybe even, not just other gods, but also maybe Platonic or Epicurean philosophy as well.
Well, the book, in addition to addressing this question of the identity of the designing intelligence responsible for life in the universe, the book also tells a story, and that is the story of Western science, that it arose in a decidedly Judeo-Christian milieu or context in Western Europe, and it did so for specifically Judeo-Christian, indeed even biblical reasons. And you can see that in the metaphors that the early scientists used to describe nature. They talked about nature as a book, contrasting it with the book of Scripture, that just as God had revealed himself in Scripture, he also reveals himself in nature, and that nature was intelligible as a book because it had been designed by a rational intellect, namely God, who built rationality, design, and order into the universe. And we could understand it, therefore it was intelligible to us because he made our minds in his image and gifted our minds with the same rationality that he himself had, and which is reflected in the design of the universe itself. The early scientists also talked about that nature was lawful, that the concept of the laws of nature was unique to the period of the scientific revolution. And it was, as one historian of science says, it was a juridical metaphor of theological origins. The idea was that there was law-like order in the universe because there was a lawgiver and someone who sustained those laws, again, namely God. And so the origins of modern science are decidedly Judeo-Christian. There are presuppositions about nature and about the nature of God that make science possible. And I explain that in these first few chapters of the book, but then also tell the story of how that perspective was lost during the 19th century, largely because of theories of origin that were proposed that essentially, as the story goes with one scientist, that he said he had no need of that hypothesis, and that the origin of the solar system, the origin of the great geological features on planet Earth, the origin of life and new life forms could all be explained as the result of unguided, undirected natural processes, such that the simplest overall worldview perspective was that of naturalism. Nature was eternal and self-existent and could account for and self-organizing, so that everything could arise from prior self-existent matter and energy that had been eternally here. So that perspective kind of came to dominate by the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And then the last part of the book discusses three big discoveries that are challenging that perspective of scientific naturalism or scientific materialism, and causing, I think, a return of first intelligent design, but also a specific kind of a design hypothesis, namely a God hypothesis.
No, I love that about the book, and in the just the first couple chapters, you really do go into detail about where the origins of this science versus God, science versus faith kind of debate. Because if I'm out on the streets and I want to share the gospel with someone, a lot of times the first thing I hear, "Oh, I believe in science," and then you have to ask, "What does that even mean?" Well, you believe in God, I believe in science. And I'm like, well, I believe in good science, but maybe go into with the audience a little bit about just some of the history of this idea of God being against science and science being against God and so forth.
Right. Well, that's really a late 19th century invention of certain revisionist historians, and I think many contemporary historians of science, I would say most contemporary historians of science who studied the period of the scientific revolution realized that the science started as a theological project. It was an attempt to reveal, as one historian of science, Rodney Stark, has put it in the title of a famous book, for the glory of God. Science was being pursued, or what was then called natural philosophy was being pursued as a way of revealing the handiwork of God. And this was implicit in Newton's great work, the Principia. He was trying to reveal the mathematical principles of the universe that he believed were an expression of divine action, of the way God was ordering the universe on a moment by moment basis. So the idea that science and religion, or still less even science and Christian religion or the Jewish faith, are in some way at odds with one another, is something that was really invented by historians of the late 19th century. Now, they were writing at a time when there was tension between science and faith, and that came about largely because of Darwin's theory of the origin of species by natural selection, and the interpretation of that work as being something that was supporting the idea that there was no design in nature, which was also, I think, what Darwin intended to convey. So there was a tension between that theory and a theological perspective, but that was by no means the overriding perspective or the overriding way of characterizing the relationship between science and faith over the preceding centuries. And as I show in the book, there may be good reasons to doubt the Darwinian account of the origin of life, and especially its denial of design. So, this is, I don't think there is an inherent conflict between science and faith, but there were prominent voices in the late 19th century who conveyed that idea, and that perspective is obviously still with us. Many of the popularizers of science today, whether we think about Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye the Science Guy, or especially the aggressive new atheists such as Lawrence Krauss and Richard Dawkins, have all conveyed the idea that science properly understood undermines belief in God, and therefore is not a belief that rational people really should hold. But that's was also part of the reason that I wrote the book. I wanted to show that the exact opposite is true, that the great discoveries of the 20th and 21st centuries about especially biological and physical and cosmological origins definitely do support, they don't undermine belief in God. They're not merely neutral. I think they have decidedly theistic implications. That is, they support the idea of an intelligent and transcendent creator.
It's interesting. You mentioned Lawrence Krauss right there. And right at the very beginning of the book, I believe it's in the prologue, you talk about how you were set to debate him, but something interesting actually was going on with you specifically when you're attempting to debate a very heady and an important topic with him. Maybe if you can give a little hint on there and let our readers know what was going on. And I think that probably helped you. Would you agree? Write this book.
Well, there was a silver lining in it, but I had a bad night at the University of Toronto a few years ago when I was set to debate Lawrence Krauss and a prominent theistic evolutionist named Dennis Lamoureux. It was a sort of a three-way conversation, but it was clearly a debate. And each person got to make an opening statement, and then there was to be a discussion afterwards among the three of us. And about 18 minutes into my opening statement, I started to develop a migraine, and bright lights had been a trigger for me, but I never had one in front of a live audience like that. And what happens to me with migraines, or did, I'm fortunately in a much better place with that, having gotten some good neurological advice and taking some magnesium supplements that have been very effective for me, at least.
Praise God.
In any case, I found that I was starting to have trouble reading my slides. It was a PowerPoint presentation, and then I was having trouble pulling words, and my voice began to echo in my head, and so it was just sort of very disorienting. And it was a 25-minute opening statement, and I slowed down and kind of got through the rest of it by using really simple phrases and just did the best I could. And a very kind Canadian doctor who had been shepherding me since picking me up at the airport before the debate took me to a dark room and covered my eyes. And when after the third person had made his opening statement, asked, do you want to try to do the discussion? I did the best I could. At the very end, some of the symptoms started to diminish, and the moderator asked us each to sum up our positions. And so I, being a bit short for words, found that I, needed to say something quite succinct, and I noted that there were three big discoveries that had been made in the last 100 years or so that, to me, seemed to support theism. The topic of the debate was what lies behind it all. And I had come hoping not just to talk about intelligent design, but also this question of the identity of the designing intelligence. Krauss was known for for a book that he'd written called Universe from Nothing, which is a popularization of something called quantum cosmology, which has been used as a kind of materialistic account of the origin of the universe itself, an account that is meant to refute the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and argue that the universe could well have popped into existence from literally nothing, save the laws of physics that allow for that possibility. And so I had come prepared to discuss that with him, but in the end, with the migraine and the way the debate ended up going, it ended up being a discussion of the opening statement that I made about the case for intelligent design in biology. In any case, at the end of the debate, we were asked to sum up our positions, and I said, well, I think there are three big discoveries that have been made that, to me, point to God as the reality behind everything, that I think support what's called classical theism. And the discoveries are that, first, the universe had a beginning. Second, the universe has been finely tuned against all odds and for no apparent underlying physical reason for the possibility of life from the very beginning of the universe. And thirdly, that that inside even the simplest living cells, we have found evidence of complex digital and nanotechnology, information present in the DNA molecule. And given what we know about the origin of information always coming from an intelligent source, that suggests to me a master programmer for life. And so I summarized these three big discoveries very briefly at the end of the debate, and found that, and then I got a lot of email from people who, of course, felt badly for having a migraine in such a high profile setting and that sort of thing. But many of them said the one thing that really stood out to me about the substance of the debate was your closing statement about those three big discoveries. And that seemed, several people said that seemed very compelling to them and they'd like to know more. And so I thought, it might be time to write the book about the identity of the designing intelligence and discuss those three big discoveries. And in the process, of course, if you've read take on this idea of quantum cosmology and that the universe might have arisen from nothing at all but the laws of physics, and show that even if that's true, even if the quantum cosmological account of the origin of the universe is correct, it too has tacit theistic implications. It seems in a subtle, it also supports in a perhaps subtle way the reality of God. Just briefly on that point, if life or if the universe arose from pre-existing laws of physics, where laws of physics are mathematical descriptions of how nature, in this case, will work, because there's not a natural world yet, that's a very strange kind of thing to assert, because the laws of physics, being purely mathematical, are therefore conceptual. And concepts and mathematical ideas only in our experience exist in minds. And so, as one of the great quantum cosmologists, Alexander Volinkhin, has pointed out, or has asked, he says, if we're saying that the universe came from pre-existing mathematical ideas, does that mean we're saying that that a mind predated the universe. So anyway, we can get more into that. But yes, it was an encounter that at the time was very, I think, unpleasant and unfortunate for people who were hoping I would have done a better job in the debate, for sure. But something really good came out of it, which was some clarity of thought about where I wanted to go next in my writing, and also some insights about this idea of quantum cosmology and the claim that the universe could have arisen from literally nothing at all, and therefore there was no need to posit God as the creator of the universe.